Hey there, friend, come a little closer to the fire with me. The room is dim, the kind of dim that makes corners feel soft instead of sharp, and the candlelight is doing that slow, patient thing it does, turning every drifting thread of dust into a tiny, floating star. Tonight I want to tell you a darker truth that history tried very hard to hide. A truth pressed between pages, rubbed faint by centuries of fingers, almost erased the way chalk disappears from a slate. It begins with women who chose to live without men and somehow grew happier, richer, safer, and more powerful because of it. It carries unsettling little details that cling to the mind like smoke. A legal phrase that meant woman alone, but worked like a secret key. City ledgers that keep whispering the same impossible number, and a word that once meant a skilled worker that later became an insult meant to bruise. And far away, much later, a different kind of fire would rise in town squares, and people would pretend it had nothing to do with money or fear, as if terror could ever be pure. If that kind of hidden history is your thing, please like and subscribe. Only if you want more nights like this, more stories told softly, where the dark edges blur into calm, and you can drift while you listen. Now, let your shoulders drop, let your jaw unclench, just a little. Breathe in slowly through your nose and out through your mouth. You do not have to hold anything up in your mind tonight. I'll carry the lantern. You can simply follow the warm circle of light. If you were standing here with me, you'd hear the logs settle in the hearth with a slow sigh, and you'd feel the steady warmth on your shins. You might notice the smell, too, that sweet, dry scent of old wood and candle smoke, and beneath it, the faint metallic whisper of ink, as if a book has been open nearby for a long time. Because that is where we begin. Not on a battlefield, not in a throne room, in a book, in a record, in the quiet place where someone once wrote down a name and a number, never imagining that centuries later we would lean in close to listen. Picture London, not the London of bright car headlights and glass towers, but London in the year 1287. The air is damp, always a little damp, as if the River Thames has breathed it into every stone. The streets are narrow and busy, and the noises are constant. Carts rattling, horses snorting, vendors calling, the clink of coins, the soft slap of shoes against wet ground. Cheapside Market is awake, as if it never slept. If you take a slow walk through it, you have to move the way you move through a crowd in a dream. Shoulders brush, sleeves graze, a hood turns, then vanishes. You smell raw wool and onions and spiced wine, and somewhere nearby, hot bread. The market stalls stand in uneven rows, timber frames and cloth awnings, the fabric darkened by mist. Everything is close. Everything is touched by hands, and then something catches your eye. Not a sword, not a noble's crest, just a stall that looks a little too orderly, a little too prosperous. The baskets are full, not half empty. The jars are sealed with clean wax. The small weights for measuring are lined up as if someone has polished them. A ledger rests on a plank table, its pages thick and pale like dried leaves. Behind the stall stands a woman. Her gaze is sharp in a calm way, not frantic, not pleading. She watches the flow of people the way a river watcher studies current. Her name, in the old records, is written as Marjorie de Clare. Sometimes the spelling shifts because ink and memory are messy, but the shape of her presence stays the same. Honestly, I've always found it strange how we imagine medieval women as shadows at the edge of the scene, as if they were never allowed to be the ones making decisions. Yet, here she is, right in the center of the noise, speaking with confidence, measuring, bargaining, smiling when it suits her, and going still when it does not. A man tries to haggle too hard, and she tilts her head just slightly, letting silence do the work. Another customer arrives, and her hands move with practiced ease, lifting a jar, checking a seal, sliding a coin into a pouch that hangs at her hip. And the record says more than that. It says she owns 3 shops, 2 houses. It says she recently closed a deal importing French wine worth more than most nobles see in a year. You can almost feel the weight of that claim, heavy as a barrel, dense as a purse full of silver. But the detail that makes the candle flame flicker in your mind is simpler. She has never been married, no husband's name attached to hers, no ring, no transfer of identity. And a court record, dry as a winter branch, says she is living her most excellent life. Yes, words like that have survived. Imagine a clerk, hunched over parchment, writing most excellent, with no irony, just reporting what he sees. You know that feeling when the past suddenly feels less distant, as if a door has opened and warm air has drifted out? That is what it is like to find a sentence like that, because it is not the voice of a poet. It is not a sermon. It is a legal document, cold, official, and even that cold voice cannot help admitting she is doing well. Now, if this were the kind of story people liked to tell themselves, they would say she was a rare exception, a strange bird, a miracle, a mistake. But the ledgers disagree. The city records whisper a number that refuses to be quiet. They suggest that in London, around that time, about 23% of property-owning merchants were unmarried women. Nearly 1 in 4. Not a rumor, not a legend. A fraction written in ink, preserved like a pressed flower inside the archives. Let that settle. 23%. Try saying it softly, like counting beads between your fingers. 2, 3. Not a tiny sliver, not a hidden handful. A visible part of the city's wealth, moving through the same streets, signing the same deals, hearing the same bells. Some scholars argue about the exact edges of the number, about definitions and categories, and which records survive the fires and floods. It's debated, as so many things are when we are listening through centuries of noise. But even if the number trembles a little, even if it shifts, the shape of the truth remains. There were many, enough that the city had a name for them, and that name is the hinge of the whole story. A phrase that sounds plain, almost harmless, when you first hear it. Femme soul, woman, alone. It could have been a label of pity. It could have been a warning. But in practice, it was something else. A doorway, a set of keys, a legal spell, if you like that kind of metaphor, though it was written in court language, not in moonlit ink. Femme soul meant a woman could stand in court as herself, not as someone's wife, not as someone's shadow. She could own property. She could sign contracts. She could sue and be sued. She could travel, make deals, hire workers, collect debts. Her name stayed on the paper. Her hands stayed on the purse strings. The strange part, the darker part, is what this implies about everyone else. Because if woman alone had to be named and protected, then the opposite must have been common. And it was. A married woman, in many places, under many laws, became nearly invisible. Her property folded into her husband's. Her earnings turned into his. Even her legal voice could be muffled until it was only a whisper behind a man's words. The fire crackles again, and you might notice how the sound is like tiny bones snapping, but gentle. Nothing you need to fear. Just wood becoming ash, slowly. History does that too. It takes a life, a name, a story, and if no one tends it, it turns to dust. So tonight, we tend the embers. We lift the names back into the light. Back in Cheapside, Marguerite de Clare finishes a sale and wipes her fingers on a cloth. The cloth is rough linen, slightly damp at the edge. She tucks it away and glances at the sky, a pale strip between roofs. A bell rings somewhere, and the crowd sways in a slow wave. Her apprentice, a younger woman, leans close and murmurs a question. Marguerite answers without looking down at the ledger, because she carries the numbers in her mind like a rosary. If you watch closely, you can see what independence looks like in small motions. The way she does not flinch when a man speaks loudly. The way she does not look around for permission. The way she says no, as if no is a tool she owns. And then the way she laughs with another woman passing by. Not a nervous laugh, but a warm one, shared like bread. And that is another lie we have been fed, that women who lived alone must have been lonely. The market itself disproves it. Look at how women pause at each other's stalls, how they trade information as lightly as they trade spices, how a hand rests on another arm for a brief moment, steady and familiar, before the crowd pulls them apart again. I want you to imagine the city as a living body. The river is its breath. The streets are its veins. The market is its heartbeat. And inside that heartbeat, the femme soul women move like a second rhythm, steady and persistent. Now, keep breathing slowly. Let your eyelids feel heavy if they want to. You do not need to remember every name. You only need to feel the shape of the world we are entering. A world where a woman alone could be a merchant, a landowner, a traveler, a lender, a friend. A world that would later pretend she never existed. Because when a truth threatens the comfort of an old order, that order does not always argue. Sometimes it erases. Sometimes it stains the language. Sometimes it lights fires and calls them righteous. Not yet. Not in our story. Not tonight. For now, the market still hums. The ink is still wet, and the candlelight still catches the dust. Later, when you step away from the market, the sound follows you for a while, even down the side lanes, even past the butcher's block where the air is sharper, even past the little chapel where a candle burns in a glass cup. The market keeps breathing. It is a living thing. It does not care who is noble and who is not. It only cares who can trade, who can count, who can keep promises long enough for trust to grow. Marguerite de Clare moves through that living noise as if she belongs to it completely. At one moment, she's leaning close to a customer, her voice low, private, the way you speak when you do not want a crowd to take what is meant for one person. At another moment, she turns, quick as a thought, and reaches into a chest beneath the table. The chest is heavy, iron-banded, its lock scratched from years of keys. She lifts out a folded scrap of parchment, checks a mark, then slides it back, careful, like someone returning a sleeping bird to a nest. The smallest actions are where you can feel the weight of a life. Her fingers are stained, not with dirt, but with the faint brown of ink. Her nails are short, her sleeves are practical, pinned back so they do not drag through spilled ale. When she laughs, she does it without covering her mouth. When she listens, she holds still, letting other people rush while she does not. There is a moment, brief, that I like to imagine. A young man, maybe a messenger, comes pushing through the crowd with a packet tied in string. He looks uncertain, scanning faces. When his eyes land on Marguerite, he hesitates. because his mind expects a man to be the owner. He almost asks for the master of the stall out of habit, and then he stops, swallows, and says her name instead. Marjorie does not correct him with anger. She simply takes the packet, breaks the wax, and reads. Or perhaps she has someone read for her, if the day is too busy. Either way, the information lands where it should land, in her hands. If you listen with your imagination, you can hear the little sounds that surround power in ordinary life. The soft clink of a scale weight placed down, the scrape of a quill returned to its holder, the thump of a barrel shifted, the hush that falls when someone realizes they cannot intimidate the person they came to intimidate. And somewhere, not far away, in a quieter room, there is another sound, the sound of writing. A clerk at a table, candle stub burning low, copying names into a ledger. He does not know he is preserving a secret. He thinks he is doing paperwork, but each stroke of ink is a thread, and if enough threads survive, a pattern appears. Centuries later, that pattern is found again in a place that smells like paper and dust. A museum hush, a reading room where people move carefully, as if the air itself is fragile. If you were standing there with me, you would feel the coolness of stone underfoot and the dryness of old parchment in the hand. You would see the way a librarian slides a box toward you without speaking, the way the lid lifts with a soft sigh, releasing a faint, sweet scent of age. Sometimes I imagine the records as a riverbed. Most of the water is gone now, drained by time, but the stones remain, and if you place your palm on them, you can feel the direction the water once ran. Names are those stones. Marguerite, Declare, Femme, Soul, 23%. Little markers that say, quietly, something flowed here. And the darker truth, the one history tried to hide, is not only that these women existed, it is that they existed in enough numbers, with enough success, that the world around them had to respond. The old story about women needing men, about marriage being the only safe harbor, about independence being unnatural, that story starts to wobble when a market stall proves otherwise, when a ledger shows a woman owning houses, when a court record uses the phrase, most excellent life, without blushing. So, the embers of the story, not hot, not dangerous, just present, a warmth you can rest your mind against. Keep your breathing slow. Feel the rise and fall in your chest like the tide of the river. And when you are ready, let your imagination drift from the noise of Cheapside into the quieter corridors where the law itself will speak, where we will see exactly how a single phrase, femme soul, could make a woman visible, and why visibility, in a world built on control, can invite shadows. The page turns with a faint rasp, like dry leaves sliding against each other. And for a moment, before we follow the ink into another city, I want you to stay with the feeling of that phrase, femme soul, woman alone, not a curse, not a punishment, a status, a shape, a set of permissions written into the world. If you were sitting here beside me, you might see how the candle flame leans when the room breathes. It bends toward the chimney, then stands straight again, patient. It reminds me of the women in these records, how they learned to bend without breaking, how they learned to stand without apology. To understand why woman alone could feel like a secret key, we have to speak softly about what happened when a woman was not alone. Because the medieval world loved to praise marriage as shelter, and in some ways, it was warmth, shared labor, protection in a harsh economy. But it could also be a kind of vanishing, a slow fading of the self into someone else's name. In many places, under many systems, a married woman's legal identity was folded into her husband's. The law had phrases for it, tidy phrases that sound harmless until you imagine living inside them. Coverture, guardianship, authority, words like blankets, thrown over a life until only a shape remains underneath. I do not say this to make you tense. Let your shoulders stay low. Let your hands rest wherever they are. We can look at hard things with a soft gaze, like watching a storm from behind a window. A married woman might work, earn, trade, even run a shop in practice. But when it came time for the record to speak, the record often spoke in a man's voice. A contract might carry his seal. A debt might be owed to him. A lawsuit might name him. And she, the one who measured the grain and counted the coins, could become a ghost, standing beside her own work. So, when a woman remained unmarried, or became unmarried through widowhood, and chose not to remarry, something curious happened. She became visible to the paperwork, visible to the courts, visible to the ledgers that decide who owns what, and who can argue, who can travel, who can hold a key. And this visibility created a kind of freedom that feels almost shocking when you first meet it in the archives. Because we have been told, again and again, that the past was a locked room for women, yet these women were carrying keys in their pockets. Let me bring you north, away from London's stamp market stones, to a different city with different bells. York in the 14th century. The air is colder here, sharper. The streets smell of smoke and wet wool. When you walk, your breath shows itself, pale and brief, like a small spirit leaving your mouth and dissolving. In a bundle of surviving letters, a name appears with the steady confidence of someone used to being listened to. Agnes Sampson, a textile merchant. Some people call her a kind of medieval venture capitalist, though she would never have used those words. She owned a network of trade that stretched across borders, and she employed more people than many minor lords could command. What I love about her, honestly, is not only the scale of her work, it is her voice. It has humor, sharpness, a little spark, contained, like a coal that refuses to go out. In one letter to a business partner, she jokes about marriage in a way that makes modern readers blink and then grin in spite of themselves. The wording varies in retellings, and we cannot be sure of every phrase, but the spirit is clear. She would rather keep her gold in her own purse than hand it over for the sake of a husband. It is not a bitter joke. It is a calm statement of preference, like choosing warm bread over stale. Try to imagine her writing. The room is quiet except for the scratch of quill. A small lamp throws a circle of light on the table. Outside, the street is muffled by fog. A servant or apprentice moves somewhere in the next room. Footsteps soft, cloth whispering. Agnes pauses, dips the quill again, and in that pause you can feel the way she owns her time. No one is calling her away to fulfill duties that swallow the day. No one is counting her minutes as if they belong to the household rather than to her mind. And she was not living in isolation. That is another myth. The records undo gently, one entry at a time. Court documents, account books, church notes, letters between women, they reveal a social life that is almost busy. Dinner parties, music, visits, travel, friendships, thick as rope. There is a diary attributed to a wealthy landowner named Isabella de Forts that describes a rhythm of days so full it almost feels modern. Morning, she manages estates, listens to stewards, reviews, rents, makes decisions about repairs. Afternoon, she studies with scholars, reads, asks questions that make learned men shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Evening, she hosts friends, music drifting through stone rooms, stories told beside fires like this one. In one line, she writes something like, I wake each day grateful that my choices are mine alone. The simplicity of it is the strange part. No grand speech, no manifesto, just gratitude, written as casually as a shopping list. If you were standing there with her, you might notice the textures, the chill of stone floors under thin shoes, the weight of a wool gown on the shoulders, the way candle smoke clings to hair, the faint grit of dust on shelves where books rest, the sound of parchment turning, the soft tapping of a ring on a cup when someone lifts their hand to gesture in conversation. It is easy, when we are tired, to think freedom must look like shouting, but in these records, freedom often looks like quiet competence, a woman signing her name, a woman sending a letter across borders, a woman choosing who sits at her table, a woman walking through a city without needing to ask permission, her footsteps steady, her hood pulled close against the damp air. And there is something else, something that keeps returning, like a refrain. These women formed networks, not only friendships, though there were many, deep and long-lasting. They formed practical alliances. They lent to one another. They partnered. They housed travelers. They shared information about prices, ships, buyers, risks. They created what later historians sometimes call chosen families, though the women themselves might have called it simply sisters, friends, trusted ones. You can almost see it in the margins of life. A note about a loan, a mention of a guest arriving from another town, an entry that records food purchased for an extra place at the table, a list of names, feminine names, repeated in different hands across different cities, like threads weaving into cloth. And cloth is the right image, I think, because the medieval world was always weaving something. Wool into garments, flax into linen, stories into reputation. And if you tug one thread, you feel the whole fabric move. For a while, this fabric held. The law, imperfect and uneven as it was, still left cracks where women could build lives. Markets still needed merchants. Cities still needed rents collected and taxes paid. And women, quiet and stubborn, stepped into those needs like water filling a hollow. But you can sense, even in the warm parts of the record, a faint cooling, a shift in tone, a tightening. It begins as murmurs, a priest frowning a little longer than necessary when he notices a woman living well without a husband, a neighbor's curiosity turning sour, a scholar writing a sentence that sounds like concern but tastes like fear. You know that feeling when a room goes quiet after someone says something true, something that makes other people uncomfortable? That kind of quiet starts to gather around these women, not because they did harm, because they proved, simply by existing, that the old story was not the only story. So keep breathing slowly. Let the fire's warmth steady you. We are still in the years when the ledgers speak plainly, when letters still laugh, when a woman can write gratitude without apology. But somewhere beyond the market, stalls and the quiet studies, another kind of ink is being prepared. Ink meant to stain, words meant to twist, labels meant to bruise. And because these voices feel so alive, it can be tempting to imagine their freedom as effortless. But it was not effortless. It was built, day by day, like a wall built from many small stones. A conversation, a signature, a careful promise kept, a refusal delivered politely, a relationship nurtured, a network maintained through distance, weather, and the slow pace of medieval roads. Agnes Sampson's letters, for example, are not only jokes and bold opinions. They are full of practical details that feel almost soothing when you read them slowly. The price of dyed cloth, the schedule of a ship, the reliability of a particular buyer, a warning about a road where thieves have been seen, a reminder to send a gift to a widow who is struggling, because it is wise to keep the web strong. If you picture her day, you can stretch it out until it becomes quiet and spacious. Morning begins with the sound of a wooden latch lifted. A door opens, cold air slides in, smelling of damp earth and chimney smoke. Agnes wraps a shawl around her shoulders, the wool scratched soft from use. She stands for a moment, listening, not for a husband's footsteps, not for a man's voice telling her what the day will be, just the city waking. She crosses a room where cloth is stacked in neat columns, each bolt tied with cord. Her fingertips press into the fabric, testing it the way you might test a pillow before you sleep. She feels for tight weave, for smoothness, for strength. A small smile touches her mouth, not because the work is easy, but because it is hers. Later, she meets a worker, a young woman with chapped hands, and they speak about wages. Agnes is firm, but not cruel. She understands, maybe more than most men did, that a business is not only numbers, it is bodies, breath, time. And if you treat people like tools, the whole machine grinds until it breaks. Then there are the moments that never make it into grand histories. The bowl of porridge eaten slowly while looking at a ledger. The quick rinse of hands in cold water before touching. Parchment again. The way she warms ink near a small flame, so it flows. The way she presses sealing wax with a practiced thumb, leaving a mark that says, "This came from me." What strikes me, the more I sit with it, is how often these women wrote about time, not as a burden to be filled with duty, but as a possession, a small kingdom, hours they could spend on study, on friendship, on planning, on simply sitting by a fire and letting the mind wander without being interrupted. And that is part of why they were not lonely. When you have agency, you can choose your company. You can cultivate your friendships like a garden. You can host, travel, correspond. You can build a life that has many doors, not only one. Imagine Isabella de Forts preparing for an evening gathering. The servants lay rushes on the floor. Someone brings in a jug of wine and sets it down with a soft thud. A lute is tuned in the corner, strings plucked once, then again, then quiet. Candles are trimmed, wicks pinched, flames made steady. Outside, the wind presses against the shutters, and inside, warmth collects in pockets. Guests arrive one by one, cloaks damp from mist, boots leaving dark marks on the stone. There are greetings, soft laughter, the clink of cups. A scholar speaks about a new idea from a distant city, and Isabella asks a question that makes him pause, then answer carefully. A friend leans close to whisper something amusing. Someone tells a story about a market dispute that ended with an unexpected compromise. And through it all, there is that subtle, steady feeling that these women are not waiting for life to begin. They are already in it. Of course, not every independent woman was wealthy. Not every femme soul sat in a hall with music. Many lived in smaller rooms, worked harder hours, had fewer cushions between themselves and hunger. The records show that too, if you look for it. Women who spun thread until their fingers ached. Women who brewed ale and carried barrels. Women who rented a single room above a shop and kept their money hidden in a seam of cloth. Still, even then, the choice to remain unmarried could mean something simple and precious, keeping what you earned. And the world noticed. The world always notices when someone steps outside the story they have been assigned. The first response is rarely a shout. It is often a change in tone, a sermon that begins to mention women alone with a hint of suspicion. A legal scholar writing a treatise that reads like worry dressed up as morality. A neighbor repeating a joke that is not really a joke because it carries a sharp edge. A word shifting its meaning, slowly, like a river changing course. We are still in the early part of the turning. The shadows are gathering at the edge, not yet stepping fully into the firelight. But if you listen to the later centuries from here, you can hear the distant echo of what comes. The insult forming, the accusation, the convenient logic that says a woman who is content without a man must be unnatural and therefore dangerous. It is an old trick, really. When you cannot deny the evidence, you change the story around it. So in the next part of our journey, we will leave England's markets and studies and cross the water toward the misty lowlands, toward a place where women did more than choose independence as individuals. They built it as a neighborhood, as a community, as a whole way of life inside stone walls and quiet streets. If you let your mind drift forward, you can already feel the change in air. Salt on the wind, a colder dampness, the sound of water moving under bridges, and somewhere ahead, the faint outline of a small village within a city, where women walk together at dawn, not as wives, not as nuns, but as something new. For now, stay warm. Let the fire's glow rest on your eyelids. Let the old words soften and blur. We will travel soon, slowly, into the fog of Flanders, where the next page waits, and the candles do not mind how long we take to arrive. The night air changes when you leave London behind. It is not a sudden change, more like a slow loosening of one scent and the gentle arrival of another. The smoke of English hearths fades, and the wind begins to taste faintly of salt, as if the sea is somewhere ahead, breathing through a narrow throat of land. If you were traveling with me, you would feel the road under your feet first, packed earth, then stone, mud that clings for a while, then finally releases. A rhythm of footsteps and pauses, the way a long journey can become a kind of lullaby when you stop expecting it to end quickly. And then, one morning, you wake to mist. Not a dramatic mist, not a ghost story fog, just the ordinary lowland kind that settles into every seam of the world. It blurs distance, softens edges, makes towers look like they are floating. You can hear water everywhere, under bridges, in gutters, in hidden canals that thread through the city like veins. The air is cool enough that your breath shows itself for a second, then disappears. Welcome, quietly, to the Low Countries, to Flanders, to a city like Bruges, where cobblestones hold the day's chill until the sun has worked hard enough to warm them, where the river does not rush like a mountain stream, but moves in a patient, heavy way, as if it has all the time in the world. Now, listen carefully, because this is where the story becomes strange in the best way. In the middle of medieval Europe, where so many lives were arranged like furniture, pushed into place by family and church and necessity, a different kind of neighborhood appeared, not hidden in a forest, not locked away behind a convent's vows, a neighborhood inside the city, built by women who wanted both independence and community, both work and quiet, both safety and choice. They were called Beguines, and the place they lived was called a Beguinage, a village within a city. If you were standing here with me at the edge of one, you might not notice anything dramatic at first. A gate, a wall, a small door that creaks when it opens. Inside, a courtyard where the grass looks carefully tended, as if someone has combed it with patience. A line of simple houses, whitewashed or pale stone, each with its own small window, each with a threshold worn smooth by many feet. The world outside is loud. Carts rattle, men shout in markets, church bells argue with each other from different towers. But inside the Beguinage, the sound changes. It becomes a hush, like the hush of a museum where everyone instinctively lowers their voice, not from fear, but from respect for the quiet. You can hear tiny things here. A broom on stone, water poured into a basin, a door latch lifted and lowered, someone humming, almost absent-mindedly, as if the melody is simply part of breathing. Honestly, I have always found it strange that the most revolutionary things in history often look, at first glance, like ordinary domestic life. A row of houses, a shared garden, a schedule written on a board. Yet inside these ordinary shapes, something radical was happening. These women were not nuns. They did not take permanent vows. They were not waiting for husbands, and they were not required to pretend they were unhappy about that. They could come and go. They could work. They could keep property. They could leave if they chose to marry later. It was a form of life that made room for choice, and choice is always a little dangerous to systems that prefer obedience. Some numbers float through the sources like pale leaves on dark water. By the early 14th century, some historians estimate there were hundreds of thousands of Beguines across northern Europe. The exact count is debated because records are uneven and language shifts. But even cautious estimates suggest a movement large enough to be felt in economies, in politics, in sermons. Large enough that it could not be dismissed as a few unusual women. If you were walking through Bruges around 1300, you would feel their presence in the cloth itself. Textiles were the heartbeat here. Wool, linen, fine cloth that traveled outward like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. And Beguines were not merely participating in the work, they were shaping it. Picture a workshop, not a romantic cottage, but a long room where looms stand like quiet animals. The air smells of wool and dye, a little sharp, a little sweet. Threads hang in pale curtains. Hands move steadily, not hurried, not lazy, just practiced. The click and clack of weaving becomes its own kind of rain, steady, predictable. A Beguine might spend her morning here, fingers guiding thread through warp, eyes tracking pattern with a calm focus. Then, in the afternoon, she might sit with other women and discuss a passage of scripture or a question of philosophy, not as an ornament, but as food for the mind. Later, perhaps music, a simple song, a shared meal, a walk in the courtyard where the grass is damp and the air smells of earth and water. This is what made the Beguinage so unsettling to the outside world. It was a life that refused to choose between the categories society offered. These women were not forced into the single narrow tunnel of wifehood, nor into the sealed chamber of permanent religious vows. They were building a third space, and third spaces have a way of making old rules look thin. The brilliance was not only spiritual or social, it was structural. They created mutual aid systems that sound almost modern when you read them slowly. Younger women caring for older ones, shared funds for illness, for hardship, for the quiet emergencies that can undo a life, affordable housing, inside walls that offered safety without imprisonment. And they were economically useful, which is one reason they survived as long as they did. In some city archives, you find records suggesting Beguine workshops produced a significant portion of fine cloth exports. Numbers like 60% appear in certain retellings, often attributed to local records, though scholars argue about scope and definition. Still, even if the percentage shifts, the shape remains. They mattered. Enough that rulers who felt uneasy about them also feared what would happen if they disappeared. That fear becomes clearer when you follow the thread to France, to a king who wanted order the way a tight fist wants control. Philip IV, called the Fair by some, tried to suppress movements that did not fit neatly into his grasp. And the Beguines, with their semi-independent status, their money, their networks, their refusal to be categorized, were difficult. Some accounts say he moved against them in the early 1300s, and the markets felt it. Production dipped, export revenues faltered, guilds complained, neighbors panicked, not from compassion, but from the simple truth that cloth was money and money was stability. It is strange, isn't it, how often the survival of a woman's freedom has depended on whether her work was profitable enough to be tolerated. There is a coldness in that thought, like touching stone that has been shaded all day. But it is part of the story. Freedom did not bloom here because society suddenly became kind. It bloomed because women were useful, because their labor was excellent, because their communities solved problems that everyone else pretended were unsolvable. And yet, usefulness is not the same as safety. A thing can be needed and still be resented. A thing can hold up a roof and still be blamed for the shadows in the corners. You can feel that resentment in the language that gathered around. Beguines, the careful accusations, the nervous sermons, the muttered suspicion that a woman living without a husband must be spiritually unstable, morally slippery, somehow too free. Here, one name rises like a candle flame that refuses to be snuffed, even when wind presses hard. Marguerite Porete, a Beguine in France in the late 13th century, who wrote a book that spoke of spiritual freedom with such boldness that it unsettled authorities. Her work, The Mirror of Simple Souls, survives in fragments and translations, and scholars still debate its exact meanings and intentions. What seems clear is that it explored a kind of inner liberty that could not be managed by outward control, and institutions built on managing outward control do not love that. The end of her story is dark. There is a sentence in the sources that says she was executed, burned, in 1310. We do not need to linger on images. We do not need to feed the mind sharpness. It is enough to know that the world responded to a woman's words with fire and then tried to pretend the ash meant the words were gone. But words are stubborn. They drift. They hide in copies. They travel in memory. They return when someone, centuries later, opens a box in an archive and breathes in that faint scent of old paper and dust. If you imagine Marguerite writing, imagine a small table, a lamp, and quiet determination, the sound of water outside, perhaps, the scratch of quill, the pause where she listens to her own breath, not because she is afraid, but because she is paying attention. The darker truth, again, is not only the punishment, it is the fear behind the punishment. A fear that women could belong to themselves. And yet, for many Beguines, daily life continued in a steady rhythm. Mist in the mornings, workshops humming, courtyards swept, candles lit, letters exchanged, friendships deepened. Some letters between Beguines, preserved here and there, speak of what they called the joy of belonging to ourselves. That phrase lands softly, like a blanket laid over the shoulders. Belonging to ourselves, not in isolation, not in selfishness, but in a calm, shared recognition that a person can be whole without being owned. There is another curious detail that returns in this part of the story, like a number whispered twice: longevity. Some sources say many Beguines lived into their 80s, even 90s, which would have seemed remarkable in an era shadowed by disease and hardship. Medical historians offer theories carefully, without certainty: lower stress, community care, freedom from the risks of repeated childbirth, better food through shared resources. We cannot be sure, but we can sense the possibility that a life built with choice and support might allow the body to rest more often. The beguinage, then, becomes more than architecture. It becomes a shelter for time itself, a place where women could age without fear of abandonment, where work and rest could alternate like tides. Still, even the calm inside the walls could not fully keep the outside world from pressing in. A city changes, a bishop changes, a law shifts, a rumor spreads, and suddenly, what was tolerated yesterday becomes questioned today. If you were walking through the Beguinage at dusk, you might feel that pressure in the smallest things. A woman glancing toward the gate when footsteps sound outside. A conversation quieting when a stranger passes. A candle being shaded with a hand, as if light itself should be cautious. It is not panic, not yet. It is the subtle awareness that visibility invites attention, and attention can turn sharp. And yet, even in that awareness, the courtyard remains. Grass damp underfoot, stone cool, the scent of bread from a shared kitchen, a bucket of water carried slowly, sloshing softly, the sound like a river's small breath. A cat weaving between ankles, warm and indifferent. This is how I want you to hold this part of the story tonight. Not as a lecture, not as a battle, as a slow walk through a place that existed, a place that proved quietly that women could build an alternative society inside a hostile one. When the world outside began to tighten, these women did what so many resilient communities do. They adapted. They used diplomacy. They leaned on their usefulness. They learned which words to say and which to keep for letters. They found ways to live between categories. But the shadow that followed independent women did not vanish. It only shifted shape. Sometimes it wore a priest's collar. Sometimes it wore a scholar's robe. Sometimes, later, it would wear the face of the law itself. And as our candlelight drifts forward, we will follow another group of women who stepped into independence not by forming communities, but by stepping into power after loss. Widows in cities like Venice, where silk curtains and gold lamps hid negotiations that shaped kingdoms. Women who inherited not only grief, but leverage. Women who learned, with a kind of quiet audacity, that mourning could be a doorway into authority. For now, let the mist stay around us. Let the Beguinage gate close gently, wood settling into its frame. Let the workshop sounds fade into the night. Click, clack, click, clack, until it becomes like rain on a roof. And let the river continue to breathe under the bridges, patient and deep, carrying our footsteps toward the next shadowed room. Now the mist thins, not because it disappears, but because the world changes around it. The lowlands fall behind, and the road begins to taste of different air, warmer, saltier, threaded with spices that cling to clothing the way memories cling to the mind. Travel is slow, as it always was, a long, patient procession of days, a cartwheel creaking, a strap tightened, a cup lifted to lips, a night slept under a roof that belongs to someone else, where you can hear unfamiliar breathing through the walls. If you were standing here with me, you would notice how the map of Europe is really a map of water. Rivers first, then seas, then the narrow channels between islands. Water carries goods. Water carries gossip. Water carries the quiet power of money from one hand to another. And so we drift gently into Venice. Venice does not announce itself with mountains or great walls. It appears the way a dream appears, as if it has always been there, and you have merely opened your eyes at the right moment. A city floating on its own reflection, stone rising from water, light trembling on canals, turning every surface into a moving mirror. The first thing you hear is not the thunder of hooves. It is the soft slap of water against wood, the hush of oars, the muted conversations that travel over canals like low music. At night, when candles glow in windows, the whole city feels like a lantern set on dark water. And inside those lantern-lit rooms, behind heavy curtains and carved doors, decisions are made with voices kept deliberately calm. This is where we meet the widows. It is easy, from a distance, to imagine widowhood as only sorrow. And yes, there is sorrow. There is a bed that suddenly feels too wide. There is a familiar coat left hanging with no body to fill it. There is a silence that has weight. But in medieval Europe, widowhood could also be something else. A key turning in a lock. You know that feeling when a door you have leaned against for years suddenly opens and you almost stumble because you were not expecting space? That is the strange, dizzy moment many widows experienced, because under many inheritance customs, a married woman's legal identity was folded into her husband's like paper into an envelope. When he died, the envelope opened, and what spilled out was agency. In Venice, the records whisper a number that makes modern people blink. By around 1,400, some accounts say, widows controlled a substantial portion of private wealth in the city. Figures around 35% appear in certain summaries of archival research. Scholars debate exact calculations, and every statistic comes with its own shadows. But the direction is hard to deny. Widows were not a small footnote in Venetian money. They were a force. A widow might inherit a third of an estate, sometimes half, depending on local law, contract, family bargaining, land, houses, ships, warehouses, loans owed, loans due. And with those assets came leverage. Not loud leverage, quiet leverage. The kind that moves through ledgers and dinner invitations and carefully timed generosity. So let us step into one of those Venetian rooms. You can almost feel the air, thicker with incense and old perfume. A chandelier overhead. A table where a map lies flat, held down by a paperweight shaped like a lion. Outside, water. Inside, silk. A widow sits at the table, not trembling, not collapsed in grief, though grief may live somewhere behind her ribs. Her hands are steady. She wears mourning black, but the fabric is fine, and the stitching is precise. Her name, in one of the most famous stories, is Caterina Cornaro, a Venetian noblewoman who became Queen of Cyprus through marriage, and then, after her husband's death, found herself in possession of a crown that was less a jewel and more a burden. The details of her reign and abdication are tangled in diplomacy, in Venetian ambition, in the delicate balancing of threats. But the shape of the story, the part that matters for our thread, is this. She did not simply vanish into widowhood. She negotiated. Some retellings describe her ruling for years, then stepping down by agreement, leaving with a settlement so generous it made her one of the wealthiest individuals in Europe. Whether every phrase of that claim is perfectly measured is debated, as all history is, but the larger truth remains. A widow could use her position to bargain with powers that expected her to be pliable. She could turn expectation into currency. Honestly, I have always found that kind of calm audacity more unsettling than any battlefield, because it shows you how power can move without shouting, how a woman can reshape an outcome simply by refusing to play the role assigned to her. And Caterina was not alone. In Florence, in Genoa, in London, in the cities stitched together by trade routes like seams, you find widows in the archives with ink-stained fingers. Their letters are practical. Their demands are clear. Their tone, often, is almost tired, as if they have no patience left for being underestimated. There is Alessandra Strozzi, in Florentine Correspondence, a widow who managed family finances and political survival through sharp letters and steadier nerves than many men around her. There is Margarita Dattini, associated with the great merchant network of Francesco Dattini, whose archives preserve the texture of business life in astonishing detail. The specifics of profit percentages and time frames sometimes get exaggerated in modern retellings because success stories invite decoration. But again, the spine holds. Women stepped into these networks and kept them alive. Picture a ledger, a thick book with pages that smell faintly of glue and leather, a candle nearby, its smoke curling toward a ceiling painted with saints who look down without comment. A widow turns a page. Her finger traces a line of numbers. She pauses, not because she cannot understand, but because she is thinking 3 moves ahead. Coins are not only metal, they are decisions. They are relationships. They are promises that can be kept or broken. A man enters the room, a merchant, perhaps, or an envoy. He bows a little too deeply, as if trying to show respect, while still believing, somewhere inside, that she is temporary. She offers him a seat. She offers wine. The glasses clink softly, like small bells. This is how widows practiced what historians sometimes call soft power. Not softness as weakness, but softness as strategy. A dinner where trade is negotiated between bites. A marriage arranged not for romance, but for alliance. A loan offered with terms that sound polite and feel unavoidable. In England, royal records hint at widows who influenced policy when kings were young or distracted. Joan of Kent, the widow of the Black Prince, is often described as having influence during the minority of Richard II. Titles and formal authority were limited, yes, but influence is not always recorded under its own name. Sometimes it appears in household accounts, payments to messengers, gifts to foreign visitors, expenses that suggest information networks, a kind of quiet machinery. And then there is the choice that appears again and again, like a refrain: remarriage. You might assume a widow would rush toward a new marriage for protection. Many did, because danger was real. But many, especially those with wealth, did something that frightened their world. They refused, because to marry again was often to hand their newly regained assets to a new husband, to fold their legal personhood back into an envelope. So they weighed companionship against control, and some chose control, not because they were cold, not because they did not feel loneliness, but because they had tasted something rare, the sweet wine of making their own decisions. There is a line attributed to Isabella de Fortibus, who appears earlier in our larger story as an independent landholder, about independence tasting sweeter than subjugation. Whether the exact wording is preserved exactly as quoted is uncertain, but the sentiment appears in many forms across letters and wills. A refusal that sounds almost gentle, yet lands like a stone dropped into still water. If you listen closely to these documents, you can hear the quiet fear of men around them. Not fear of witches, not yet. Fear of a woman who can say no and mean it, because an unmarried wealthy widow could become a small government. She could fund projects. She could refuse to fund them. She could shift trade routes by choosing one partner over another. She could lend money to kings. Some English financial records mention loans to royal campaigns, and stories circulate of widows in London collectively lending large sums. Numbers like 50,000 marks appear in certain retellings, compared to modern values in dramatic ways. The comparisons are always slippery. Currencies shift, economies change, but again, the core is true enough to hold. Women with money mattered to war, to cathedrals, to politics, to the bones of the world. There is a darker underside here, too, and we should not look away, though we can look softly. When wealth sits in the hands of someone society thinks should not hold it, others begin to reach. Family members, officials, clerks, even priests, sometimes with eyes that are too interested in a widow's generosity. A widow's assets could be challenged in court, her competence questioned, her intentions scrutinized, and in that scrutiny, you can feel the beginnings of a pattern that will later become much more violent, the pattern of treating female autonomy as suspicious. For now, in this part of the story, the suspicion is often wrapped in velvet, a lawyer's polite smile, a cousin's concerned tone, a sermon about the dangers of women without male guidance. A widow answers with patience, because patience can be armor. She signs documents. She keeps copies. She pays scribes. She makes sure her seal is pressed firmly. Wax cooled before it is handled. Proof that she knows what she is doing. And she does not only protect herself. Many of these women used wealth in ways that widened paths for others. You see it in bequests, money left for dowry funds, so poor girls could avoid desperate marriages, loans offered to other widows, payments to what a woman might call her sisterhood, a circle of support that looks, in the margins of history, like a network of women refusing to let each other fall. Philanthropy, too, changes shape in their hands. Instead of only donating to churches, some funded education, healthcare, the kinds of services that quietly keep communities alive. There are stories of scholarship funds for girls, of endowments written with astonishing clarity about why education matters. Again, the details vary, and some examples may be singular rather than widespread, but the impulse is visible. A woman who knows what money can do chooses to aim it. Picture one of those documents, parchment laid flat, ink still dark, a phrase about ensuring a woman's independence, written as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. You can almost hear the scratch of the pen, the pause, the breath. It makes me wonder, sometimes, what it would feel like to hold that parchment in your hands, to feel the texture of it, to know you are touching a decision made centuries ago by someone who would never meet you, yet who shaped the world you inherited. And while these widows were moving through silk rooms and legal chambers, something else was happening in markets and workshops. Ordinary women, not noble, not crowned, were building their independence from the ground up, counting beads, keeping accounts in their heads, running breweries and rope shops and wool stalls. We are drifting toward them next, toward the self-made women who turned commerce into freedom, toward names that appear in guild records like brief sparks, a brewer, a weaver, a merchant with a seal. Women who, like the Beguines, proved their usefulness and paid for it with attention, because as women's independence became more visible, the world's discomfort deepened, and discomfort, when it cannot argue, often reaches for something darker, a label, a rumor, a charge that turns neighbors into judges. Not yet. For now, stay in Venice with me a moment longer. Listen to the water under the window. It is always there, always moving, always returning. Listen to the soft sound of a candle wick adjusting itself, a tiny crackle. A widow closes her ledger. She presses her palm to the cover as if to feel the weight of her own life. Then she stands, and her footsteps are quiet on the floorboards, almost like a prayer. Outside, the canal keeps breathing. Inside, the room holds its hush. And somewhere beyond the curtains, beyond the lantern-lit water, markets are waking. Looms are starting their steady click, and the next chapter of our story is already gathering, patient as dust settling on a shelf. The markets wake before the sun fully decides to rise. There is a moment, just before dawn, when a city feels half asleep, when even the stones seem to be breathing slowly, and then a shutter lifts, a latch clicks, a cartwheel groans, and the whole place begins to hum. If you were walking beside me now, you would smell it first. Yeast and wet wool, smoke from early fires, the metallic tang of river water, a faint sweetness from fruit laid out on straw, and underneath it all, that old reliable scent of people living close together, cloth, skin, bread, and time. We have left the velvet rooms of Venice and the misted courtyards of the Beguinage, and we have come to the places where money changes hands in plain sight, to stalls and workshops, to counting beads and chalk marks, to the loud, ordinary miracle of trade. This is where another kind of independent woman appears, not crowned, not enclosed behind walls, but standing right in the middle of the noise, doing something that looks so practical, it almost hides how radical it is. She is keeping her own accounts. There is a sound that belongs to this part of the story. Not a bell, not a hymn, a small click, 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 as fingers move along beads, as if each bead is a heartbeat made visible. It is the sound of focus. It is the sound of refusing to drift. It is the sound of a woman deciding that the numbers will belong to her. Picture England, late 14th century, a town where the air carries the smell of grain and ale, where roofs are thatched and the streets are narrow enough that you can brush sleeves with strangers. In one corner of this world, a woman who cannot read sits with a ledger she cannot decipher, and yet she knows the business better than anyone around her. Her name, in many retellings, is Margherita Kempe. History remembers her, mostly for her spiritual autobiography, the first in English by a woman, but the records and the legends around her also paint her as something else. A woman with an instinct for trade, for profit, for opportunity, Some details are debated, and the numbers often grow larger in modern storytelling, but the core remains. She built a life that did not require a man to sign her name. Imagine her at a table near the door of a brewery. The room is warm with steam. Barrels line the wall like sleepy giants. She listens. That is her literacy. She listens to the way customers speak about taste, about price, about how far they traveled for this ale. She listens to the way suppliers hesitate when they negotiate. She listens to the way coins sound when they hit wood, dull or bright depending on their metal. When a contract must be made, she uses memory and witnesses. She repeats the terms out loud, slowly, as if placing stones in a careful line. She knows that a spoken agreement can be both fragile and powerful, depending on who hears it and remembers it. So, she chooses her witnesses like a general chooses terrain. And there are other women like her. In Paris, guild records and city documents suggest women held leadership roles in many trades, from silk weaving to brewing to gold work. Not always welcomed, not always celebrated, but present. In towns like York, the percentages of women owning commercial property appear again and again in the sources, numbers that startle modern readers because we have been taught to imagine medieval commerce as entirely male. Sometimes you see a figure like 23% for certain urban records. The exact scope and category may vary, but the surprise does not. Women were not absent. They were visible enough to worry people. If you were walking through a market street like Cheapside in London, the same street we visited earlier, you might notice how many stalls are run by hands that are not broad and bearded, hands that are quick, hands that are steady, hands that pull cloth across a counter and smooth it as if smoothing a thought. A woman like Marjorie, the unmarried merchant, with multiple shops, becomes less of a singular marvel and more of a signpost, a reminder that the category woman alone was not only a social condition, it was a legal tool, a status that could allow property and contracts to remain in a Brem, woman's own name. That legal term, Femme, soul, drifts through the documents like a quiet spell. Not magic, not superstition, law. The kind of magic that decides who can sue, who can travel, who can sign, who can own. Married women, in many legal contexts, were folded into their husbands. Unmarried women and widows could, in certain cases, stand alone. And once you can stand alone, you can negotiate. I want you to imagine the smallest moment. A woman in a rope workshop in Paris. The air is sharp with hemp. Fibers cling to her sleeves. Her hands are rough, but she moves with care because a rope is only as trustworthy as the twists inside it. Her name, in some retellings, is Denise Lacordier. Whether that exact name belongs to one documented person or has become a representative figure is debated, but the strategy described is real enough to ring true. When competitors try to undercut her, she does not panic. She controls the supply. She buys the best hemp. She lets others scramble for inferior fibers. And then she speaks about quality as if it were a moral virtue. She turns durability into reputation. And reputation, in medieval trade, is a kind of currency that never sleeps. Or picture England again. In the wool trade, a woman called Rose of Burford in certain modern summaries is described as cutting out middlemen and dealing directly with Flemish buyers, even marking wool with her own seal. A promise of grade, a quiet brand. Maybe the details have been polished by time, but the idea is unmistakable. Women learned to build trust and to make trust visible because they could not rely on guild protection the way men could. They had to be exceptional. not once, but repeatedly. And then there is the strange sweetness of innovation. A woman, perhaps in Scotland or some trading town, is said to have invented installment payments for luxury goods, allowing customers to pay over time with interest. Whether this was truly the first such system is difficult to prove, because credit has older roots than any single name, but it is not hard to imagine women experimenting with payment structures. When you are excluded from the straightforward path, you start building side paths. You start making doors where there were only walls. The more you read these traces, the more you see a pattern. Independent women did not simply survive in a male-dominated world. They adapted into it the way water adapts to stone, finding cracks, widening them slowly, making a route where none seemed possible. They also built networks. This part matters, maybe more than any single success story, because one woman can be dismissed as unusual. A network cannot. In London, in Florence, in cities where the air smells of ink and wool, you find hints of associations, informal councils, shared funds, friends who are also business partners. Some records describe something like a sisterhood of commerce, women lending each other money in emergencies, sharing intelligence about markets, warning each other about dishonest customers. Maybe not under a single official name, maybe not with a charter that could be confiscated, but alive nonetheless. Alive in letters, alive in ledgers, alive in the way a woman traveling for trade knows exactly whose door to knock on when she arrives in an unfamiliar city. If you have ever had a friend who simply believes in you, quietly, steadily, you know how powerful that is. Now imagine dozens of such friends, spread across cities, connected by messengers and seals and code words folded into ordinary language, a safety net made of ink and trust. And here is something that feels almost tender in its practicality. Many women set aside what they called, in some records and later interpretations, a kind of independence insurance, savings not for luxury, but for the simple promise: I will not be forced to marry for money. I will not be cornered by hunger. I will not be softened into submission by lack. It is easy to romanticize this, and we should resist that. The medieval world was harsh. Illness could ruin a business. A fire could erase a lifetime. A lawsuit could swallow property. A rumor could turn neighbors cold. These women knew. That is why they counted so carefully. That is why they wrote when they could. That is why they remembered when they could not. Now, let's slow down and step into one day in the life of a woman like Agnes Sampson, the merchant whose surviving letters are often described as witty and sharp, even if the exact wording of her jokes shifts across retellings. The voice that comes through is unmistakable. A woman who sees through the social script and refuses to pretend she cannot. Morning. She wakes in a room that smells faintly of linen and wax. Outside, the street is still quiet. She sits up slowly, letting her thoughts settle, as if she is arranging tools on a table. She washes her face with cool water that wakes her without startling. She dresses in layers, fabric sliding over skin, fastening ties with fingers that have done this 1,000 times. Then she walks to her work. The door of her shop opens with a familiar scrape. Dust lifts in a small, lazy cloud, caught briefly in the light. She inhales. Wool, ink, wood. She runs her hand along the counter, feeling the grain, feeling the slight nick near the corner where a heavy spool once landed. Small marks of a life built. Midday. She meets a supplier. They talk about price, about quality, about how the roads have been lately. She listens for hesitation, for the moment when a lie tries to pass as truth. She answers with calm. No raised voice, no trembling, just the steady insistence of someone who knows her worth. Afternoon. She writes a letter or dictates one. A messenger waits, shifting weight from foot to foot, smelling faintly of horse and rain. She folds the parchment carefully. She seals it. Wax, soft, then cooling. A press, a mark, a promise. Evening. She hosts a small meal. Friends come. Other women, maybe one or two trusted men who understand their place. Bread is broken. A candle is trimmed. Music, perhaps a simple instrument, a voice humming. They talk about business, yes, but also about books, about dreams, about the strange freedom of sitting by your own fire with no one else deciding what your night should be. This is the secret the outside world could not tolerate. Not the money alone, not the property alone, the contentment. Because contentment is proof. It says, I am not waiting to be saved. I am not incomplete. I am not ashamed. And that proof made people nervous. You can feel the nervousness gathering in small shifts. A priest's sermon that lingers too long on proper order. A scholar's treatise that insists women need guidance. A neighbor's compliment that is edged with suspicion. You are clever, almost too clever. Language begins to change. An occupational term like spinster, once simply a description of a craft, starts to acquire a different flavor. A word can become a cage if enough people agree to use it that way. And then, slowly, the darkness leans in. Not all at once. Not with a thunderclap, with a whisper. Because when society cannot argue with evidence, it looks for another explanation. If a woman is successful, she must have cheated. If she is independent, she must be unnatural. If she is content, she must be hiding something. It begins in gossip, a story told over bread, a remark made after a dispute, a complaint from a competitor who wants her customers, a grievance from a cousin who wants her property, and then it becomes something else, a formal accusation, a record written in ink, a word that has the power to turn a neighbor into an executioner, which that word is not yet the main sound of our story, but it is approaching like footsteps in a hallway. You can hear them if you listen, soft at first, then clearer. In some towns, you can almost trace the path. A successful woman refuses a marriage proposal. A child falls ill in the neighborhood. A cow dies. A harvest disappoints. The human mind, hungry for a reason, for someone to blame, turns toward the person who already stands slightly apart, the woman alone. So, as you rest here with me by the fire, let the market sounds soften. Let the click of beads become slower, gentler. Let the smell of wool fade into the background. Hold the image of a woman closing her shop at dusk, pulling the shutter down, hearing it thump into place. She locks the door. She pockets the key, a small metal weight in her palm, warm from her skin. She walks home, footsteps on stone, water somewhere nearby, always. She passes a group of neighbors who pause their conversation just long enough to watch her. Not hostile yet, just attentive. She lifts her chin, not defiantly, just naturally, as if she is remembering that she owns her life. And the dark truth, the one we are moving toward, is that sometimes that is enough to make the world decide you are dangerous. We will follow that truth next, into towns where courts begin to listen too eagerly to rumors, where manuals are written to justify fear, where fire becomes a tool of policy. For now, let the candlelight stay gentle. Let the door remain closed. Let the night hold her in its quiet. as the footsteps in the hallway draw nearer, patient and cold. The first thing to understand about fear is how ordinary it can look. It does not always arrive with torches. Sometimes it arrives as a meeting in a small room, a table, a clerk with ink on his fingers, a judge who looks tired, as if he would prefer to be anywhere else, yet still does his work. And fear also arrives in the shape of a book. If you were standing beside me now, you would see how harmless a book can seem at first. Leather cover, pages, a faint smell of dust and glue, something you could hold in your hands like a prayer book. But there are books that teach people how to harm, and do it with a tone that pretends to be reasonable. In the late 15th century, a manual appears that later becomes infamous, the Malleus Maleficarum. Its influence and actual use varied by region and time, and scholars debate how directly it drove prosecutions. But its existence matters as a symbol, because it took the swirling anxieties of a world in flux and pinned them to one target: women. Especially women who did not fit obedient shapes. The book, and others like it, spoke of women as morally weak, easily tempted, dangerous when ungoverned. It described female independence not as a social choice, but as a spiritual risk. And once fear is dressed in the language of righteousness, it becomes very hard to argue with. Now, we have to be careful with numbers. Historical estimates of those executed for witchcraft across Europe between roughly 1,450 and 1,750 range widely, often cited between about 60,000 and 100,000, depending on methodology and region. The exact number is debated. Records are incomplete. Some trials are lost. Some were never written down. But whatever number you hold, the weight of it is real. And within that weight, another pattern appears again and again. Most of the executed were women, often estimated around 80% or more in many regions. And among these women, many shared a trait that is both simple and chilling. They lived without male guardianship, unmarried, widowed, separated, abandoned, or simply unwilling to fold themselves into someone else's life. You know that feeling when a room changes the moment one person enters, not because they are loud, but because everyone suddenly becomes aware of them. That is what independent women became in many communities during the worst waves of witch hunting, a presence that disrupted the old assumptions. In some German territories, records suggest single women were accused at far higher rates than married women of similar age and status. A historian named Wolfgang Behringer has written about patterns in certain Bavarian contexts, and other scholars have traced similar imbalances elsewhere. We should not flatten Europe into one story, because each region has its own texture, its own local politics, its own weather of belief. Still, the shadow moves in a recognizable way. Let me take you, gently, to a town square, not to show you violence, not to carve sharp images into your mind, only to let you feel the atmosphere that made cruelty possible. It is winter, or close to it, cold enough that breath shows, cold enough that people keep their hands tucked into sleeves. The square is quiet, but not peaceful. It is the kind of quiet that holds itself too tightly. A crowd gathers. Not everyone came willingly. Some came because they were ordered. Some came because they feared being noticed if they stayed away. Some came because they wanted to see, the way people sometimes stare at storms. At the center is a platform, or a post, or simply a cleared space. The details vary across places, and we do not need to fix them in the imagination. What matters is the accusation, the charge that transforms a human being into a symbol. A woman stands there. Her name, in one often repeated example, is Anna Hansen, associated with Würzburg in 1,628 inches. Certain modern narratives, though specific local records can be complex, and names can shift in retellings. Whether we hold to that exact name or treat it as representative, the pattern remains heartbreakingly consistent. She lived alone. She owned property. She refused proposals. She was successful enough to be noticed. And notice can become a trap. What do the trial records say? In many cases, they say she was unnatural. They say her independence is evidence that she must have help from something outside the human world. They say her refusal to accept male authority is proof of a pact, a conspiracy, a spiritual crime. Listen to how the logic works. It is not logic, really. It is a ladder built from assumptions. A woman who thrives without a husband challenges the belief that women need husbands to be whole. That challenge makes people uncomfortable. Discomfort searches for an explanation. The explanation becomes supernatural. Supernatural becomes criminal. Criminal becomes punishable. And once you have a system that can turn discomfort into death, it will be used. There is another case often described from Bamberg, around 1,627 or 1,628, involving a woman said to have owned a tavern and been accused in part because she was content living alone. Names vary in retellings. Margaret something, sometimes written as Margaret H., sometimes shaped by translation and shorthand. The specifics of a single case can be hard to hold with certainty without the full transcript in front of us. But again, the spine of the story is sturdy. A businesswoman becomes a target. Her competence becomes suspicious. Her savings become desirable. Because there is a second darkness here, one that smells of ink and coins. Confiscation. In many jurisdictions, when a person was accused of witchcraft, their property could be seized, sometimes immediately, sometimes after conviction, sometimes through fines that strangled the family. The money funded the machine. Jailers, clerks, judges, executioners, even the wood and rope and iron, the ordinary materials of cruelty. There are accounts, for example, of the Würzburg Prince Bishop Julius Ector benefiting from confiscated wealth during the intense persecutions of the 1620s. The details of specific projects and funding streams are debated, and historians work carefully with surviving account books, but the general point is grimly clear. Witch trials could be profitable, and anything profitable tends to reproduce itself. Imagine a ledger again. Not a merchant's ledger this time, but a judicial one. A list of names. Next to each name, a list of assets. A house, a field, a shop, a trunk of linens, a few pieces of jewelry, a loan owed to her, a debt owed by her. The clerk writes it down with the same calm hand he uses for taxes. Ink does not tremble. It simply records. And in that calm handwriting, you can feel the true horror, how normal it became. Now, I want to slow the story down and bring it close, because the broad sweep of history can make suffering feel distant, like thunder far away. But if you bring it near, carefully, softly, it becomes something else. A human breath in a cold room. Picture a woman at home on an ordinary morning. She wakes and hears water outside. Always water somewhere. A gutter, a canal, a river. She lights a candle. The flame catches, then steadies. She warms her hands near it, feeling the small comfort of heat. She has plans, a supplier to meet, a customer to speak with, a letter to send. Maybe she will host a friend later, or simply sit by her own fire with a book or with her thoughts. Then there is a knock. A knock has its own sound, soft, then harder. Wood on wood, a pause, another knock. When she opens the door, there are men she recognizes, a constable, a neighbor, a clerk, faces that do not meet her eyes for long. They speak in the language of procedure. They do not say, "We are afraid of you." They say, "There have been concerns." They say, "We must ask you some questions." They say, "It is for the good of the community." The community. That word can be warm. It can also be a blade. She is taken to a room that smells of damp stone, a bench, a table, a candle whose smoke curls upward like a thin, restless thought. She is asked about her life. Why did she not marry? Why does she have money? Who taught her to read? If she reads, which women does she correspond with? Who visits her? Who borrows from her? Who owes her? Do you see how the questions are not really about spells or devils? They are about networks, about money, about independence, about female association. Interrogators in many witch trials were obsessed with lists, names, contacts, relationships, because the goal was not only to condemn one woman, it was to map the web and then tear it. Under pressure, under pain, under exhaustion, people will say almost anything to make the world stop. And so, names spill out, not because they are true, because the body cannot hold endless suffering. Those names become new cases, new arrests, new confiscations. The machine feeds itself. This is why some historians argue that witch hunts, at least in certain regions and periods, functioned as an economic and social war against female autonomy. Not the only cause, never the only cause, but a cause braided tightly into the others. Religious conflict, local rivalries, climate stress, political consolidation, personal grudges, all of it swirling together, then narrowing again and again toward the woman alone. There is another layer, quieter but enduring, psychological terror. You do not have to accuse every independent woman. You only have to accuse enough. A few trials in a town can reshape behavior for generations. Imagine a woman in the market hearing what happened to someone like her. She goes home and looks at her accounts. She looks at her property. She looks at the key in her pocket, and she feels something cold move through her chest. Maybe she sells her shop. Maybe she accepts a marriage she does not want. Maybe she stops visiting her friends. Maybe she stops writing letters because ink can be used against you. Maybe she speaks less, smiles less, keeps her eyes down, performs smallness as a kind of camouflage. This is how terror works best. Not by killing everyone, by teaching the living to shrink. In some places, records suggest women's property ownership drops sharply after intense periods of persecution. Numbers like 31% falling to single digits appear in certain summaries, though local data varies and interpretation is complex. Still, the pattern is haunting. Independence visible, then independence punished, then independence erased. And once erased, it becomes easy for later generations to say it never existed. I want to pause here, beside the fire, and let you breathe. Slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Let your jaw soften. Let your shoulders drop. Because even though we are speaking of dark things, you are safe here in the telling. We are holding the story gently, the way you hold a fragile cup. There is something else the witch hunts changed, something that lingers like smoke long after the flame is gone. Trust between women. When authorities forced the accused to name others, when fear taught people to watch their neighbors, friendships became dangerous. A woman might avoid another woman, not because she disliked her, but because closeness could be interpreted as conspiracy. Networks that had protected women began to look, in the eyes of power, like criminal organizations. And so women learned to hide their solidarity, to disguise it as ordinary visiting, ordinary charity, ordinary religion. They learned to speak in codes, to make their support invisible again. This is where the story grows almost unbearably sad, not because of the executions alone, but because of the quiet narrowing of possibility. A world that once held beguinages and femme soul merchants begins to tighten. A world that once tolerated a woman's competence begins to pathologize it, criminalize it, burn it out of view. Still, there were always those who resisted, not loudly, not with banners, with small decisions. A woman who lends money anyway, discreetly. A woman who shelters a friend for a night. A woman who keeps a copy of a forbidden book hidden under linens. A woman who teaches another woman to count, to keep accounts, to remember. Quiet resistance has its own music. A candle lit in a room where someone hoped darkness would win. A letter sent with ordinary words that carry extraordinary meaning. A hand on another hand, steady, warm, saying without speech, "You are not alone." We will need that music as we move forward, because the next chapters of this story show how power learned to use not only fire, but language, medicine, and law to keep women small. Words becoming cages, diagnoses becoming shackles, shame becoming policy. For now, let the square fade, let the cold air soften, let the book close its pages, settling like tired birds, and listen instead to the gentler sound of water moving under a bridge, the river's patient breath that does not judge, does not accuse, only carries time forward. In the candlelight, we can still see the outlines of what was lost. And in seeing it, softly, we begin to return it to memory, one quiet breath at a time. The fire has settled into a slower conversation now. No sudden crack, just a steady glow that makes the room feel held together by warmth and shadow, as if candlelight is stitching the dark to the walls, one quiet thread at a time. And when we speak of how society learned to control independent women, we have to look beyond the obvious terrors. Not only the public trials, not only the confiscations, not only the fear that could make a whole village swallow its kindness. There was another campaign, softer on the surface, almost polite. It worked through ink, through dictionary pages, through the small, everyday words people used without thinking. Honestly, I have always found it strange how a single word can feel like a verdict, not because the word is loud, but because it arrives already carrying a whole history of judgment in its pockets. So let us drift gently into language. Picture a clerk again, not in a court this time, but at a desk in a city office. His quill scratches, his wrist aches slightly from repetition. He writes names in a register, and then, beside the names, he writes categories: married, widowed, unmarried. At first, those categories are plain, almost neutral, the way a basket is neutral until someone decides what belongs inside it. But over generations, the basket becomes a cage. There is a word that began as a trade, a simple label for a skilled worker who spun thread into something useful. Spinster, a woman who could take raw fiber and turn it into order. If you have ever watched someone spin, you know it is a kind of meditation. The wheel turns, the fingers pinch, then release. The thread grows longer, smooth and steady, catching the light like a thin river. It is work that asks for patience and rhythm, the same qualities these women needed to build lives of their own. In the 14th century, the word could be respectable, an occupation, a proof that she had a craft, a way to earn, a way to stand. Then the meaning begins to shift, quietly, almost invisibly. By the 17th century in England, legal documents often used spinster as a formal designation for an unmarried woman, and by the early 18th century, dictionaries begin recording the sour taste that had seeped into it. The idea of a woman unmarried, beyond the expected time, a word now shadowed by pity or mockery. Notice how gentle the mechanism is. No one has to shout. No one has to build a scaffold. They only have to make sure the word itself feels like a lowered gaze. Meanwhile, what happens to the word for an unmarried man? Bachelor. In older roots, it suggests a young knight, an apprentice, a man with promise. Even when he is older, the word does not collapse into shame. It stays light, almost celebratory. Eligible bachelor, confirmed bachelor, a man about town. Same legal status, different atmosphere. One word that implies failure, another that implies choice. And once language carries that difference, it begins to shape the imagination. People start to feel that a woman alone is a problem, while a man alone is simply independent. This is what makes language warfare so effective. It works under the skin. It slips into jokes, into sermons, into casual advice given over bread. It tells women how they should feel about themselves long before anyone needs to threaten them with punishment. You know that feeling when you overhear someone use a word with a smile that is not kind? A small laugh, polite on the surface, but sharp underneath. That is how these words traveled. They moved through rooms the way smoke moves, thin at first, then everywhere. A judge in a cramped court asks an unmarried woman why she has not married, as if her legal standing requires a confession. A neighbor, leaning over a fence, says she must be odd to enjoy her own company. None of it needs to be proved. The phrase itself becomes the proof. Some women resisted this, quietly, in contracts, in signatures, in the way they named themselves. They wrote merchant, not spinster. They wrote their trade first, their competence first, as if to say, do not reduce me to a marital absence. Sometimes resistance is humor, a bright, quick blade. A woman writing to a friend might joke that marriage sounds like sharing a purse with a stranger who keeps forgetting it is not his. The laughter in those lines is not shallow. It is survival. It is the sound of someone refusing to be shamed. Now, let the scene soften again. The candle flames tilt slightly, as if listening. Outside the window, wind moves through branches with a slow sigh. And while the secular world was sharpening words into weapons, another world was quietly sheltering a different kind of female power. Behind convent walls, the sound changes. Markets fade, courtrooms fade. What remains is the hush of stone corridors, the slow echo of footsteps, the smell of wax and cold air and old books. If you were standing here with me, you would feel the temperature drop. Not unpleasantly, just enough that your skin notices. Your breath becomes a little clearer. The candles burn with smaller flames, as if conserving themselves. A convent is often imagined as a refuge for the unwanted, but the record suggests something more complicated. In many places, convents were among the only institutions where women could rise into formal authority, managing land, finances, diplomacy, even large communities of dependents. An abbess could be, in effect, an executive, a judge within her domain, a negotiator, a guardian of property. Sometimes she answered only to a distant hierarchy, and even then, she often had room to maneuver. Think of an abbess pacing her private chamber in 12th century France, a room with a small window that frames a slice of gray sky. Her robe brushes the floor. She pauses at a chest filled with documents, rents owed, contracts, correspondence. She opens one parchment and runs her finger along the lines, as if she can feel the meaning rise through her skin. Some convents held astonishing wealth. Shaftesbury Abbey in England, for example, appears in Domesday Book as extraordinarily wealthy, second only to the king in certain measures. Records of other houses show vast land holdings, mills, breweries, rents from towns, networks of trade. And then there are the names that drift through history with a soft glow of candlelight and intellect. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, composer, writer, and visionary. Her exact financial figures vary in retellings, and we should be cautious with the neatness of numbers, but her influence is not in doubt. She wrote, composed, corresponded with powerful men as an equal, and spoke with the authority of someone who had claimed her own mind. There are stories of abbesses who negotiated like diplomats. They sent letters to kings and bishops, arguing over rents and rights and borders, using the same legal vocabulary men used, but turning it toward the protection of their own houses. Some even signed in ways that made distant correspondents assume a man held the pen, not out of shame, but out of strategy. A name can be armor, after all. Imagine the moment she decides to do it. She sits at a table, the wood worn smooth by generations of elbows. A small pot of ink waits like a pool of night. She practices the signature once, twice. The unfamiliar shape of the title feels strange in her mouth, even as she writes it, but she understands the trade. If the world respects a masculine seal more easily, then she will use the world's weakness against it. And because convents were not only spiritual centers but also economic ones, the abbess learns to read ledgers the way some people read weather. A column of numbers tells her which tenant is struggling. Another column tells her which roof needs repair. She can smell the future in these pages, the way a sailor smells rain. So we hold both truths, the trap of language and the loopholes women built, the cage and the keys. If you listen closely, you can hear those keys in this room too, faintly, like the soft clink of a chain settling. Not a chain that binds, but a chain that carries tools. And as we breathe slowly, as the fire settles into embers, we can feel ourselves nearing the next threshold, the place where a woman might choose companionship, but only on terms that let her remain whole. Somewhere beyond the convent walls, beyond the market stalls and the courtrooms, ink is drying on another kind of document, a letter that sounds almost modern, seeking an equal, seeking respect, seeking a life that does not shrink. We will follow that letter soon, step by unhurried step. Let me linger inside these walls a little longer, because this is where time feels thick, where dust settles in slow layers on stone, and the present seems to borrow its pace from centuries. In a great hall, the abbess meets her officers, not soldiers in shining armor, but stewards with ink-stained fingers, Cellarers counting barrels of ale, a porter who knows every face that passes the gate. They speak quietly about rents, about a dispute with a nearby lord, about a bridge washed by winter water. The abbess listens the way a river listens to rain, taking it in, deciding where to send it. Some abbesses held rites that sound unbelievable if you have only heard the simplified stories of medieval life. In certain places, an abbess could sit with princes. In Quedlinburg, for instance, the abbess was an imperial princess, woven into the political fabric of the Holy Roman Empire. She could command, negotiate, and hold land as a ruler, not merely as a caretaker. Even the smallest details carry that authority. A seal pressed into wax, warm and soft under the stamp. A parchment rolled, tied with thread. A messenger's boots leaving damp prints on the floor as he bows, then backs away, careful not to turn his back too quickly. And there is education. I want you to imagine a room lined with shelves, not grand like a modern library, but rich in its own way. Manuscripts wrapped in cloth, pages edged with fingerprints. A sister lifts a book carefully, as if it is a sleeping bird. She reads aloud, not fast, but with reverence, letting each sentence land. In some houses, women studied logic, rhetoric, music, medicine, mathematics, scripture. They copied texts, yes, but they also argued with them, annotated them, expanded them. A curriculum can be a doorway, and these women learned to walk through it. There is a story, often told, of a convent where teaching became systematic, disciplined, almost like a quiet university. The details blur in retellings, and we cannot be sure of every line, but the larger pattern remains. Convents could become engines of learning, and the women inside could become scholars whose influence traveled far beyond the walls. Music, too, moved through these corridors, a single voice at first, then another, until the sound fills the stone like warm water. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel it on your skin. Not a performance meant for applause, but a practice meant to shape the heart, to steady the mind. And yes, there is wealth here, and management, and strategy. Convents invested. They leased land. They operated mills and breweries. They hired labor. They negotiated with merchants. They maintained relationships across distance, a network of letters moving like thin veins of communication across Europe. This is what I mean when I say the world relied on female competence, even when it pretended not to. So, when we return, for a moment, to the weaponized words outside, we can see how fragile that propaganda was. If women were truly incapable, why did so many institutions, even patriarchal ones, depend on their administration? Why did the economy lean on their work, their calculations, their ability to organize people? The answer is not that society did not know. It knew, and it panicked anyway. Because knowledge and power are different things, you can admit a woman is capable and still fear what happens if she chooses her own life. So, the language kept doing its quiet work, the jokes, the sermons, the little, sideways glances, the constant suggestion that a woman alone must be either sad or suspicious. Yet under that pressure, women kept making choices. Some chose a life inside walls of stone. Some chose the market, the ledger, the ship's manifest. Some chose a household of friends, a chosen family, a table with many chairs but no husband at the head. And some wanted love, not as rescue, not as surrender, but as partnership. That is the door we are approaching now. You can almost hear it, the faint creak of hinges in the dark. Beyond it, letters are waiting, Contracts, meetings arranged under the cover of business, small tests of character, the way you might test a piece of cloth by rubbing it between your fingers. For now, let your shoulders drop, let your jaw soften, let the room keep its gentle heat. The fire is steady, the dust is calm, and the story is ready to carry us onward. The fire is lower now, more ember than flame. It makes the shadows softer, as if the room has decided to stop arguing with the night and simply belong to it. If we step through that creaking door we imagined, we find ourselves in a different kind of archive. Not the archive of trials and accusations, but the archive of choices. Letters folded into thirds, contracts sealed with wax, small notes tucked into prayer books, a whole hidden world of women deciding what they will and will not accept. And this is where the story becomes almost tender, even as it stays dark beneath the surface. Because the danger did not vanish, the pressure did not dissolve. Yet women kept inventing ways to live, to love, to grow older with dignity without handing their lives away. Imagine London again, not as a postcard but as a living body, Cheapside at dawn, the stones still damp from night air, a thin fog slipping between stalls like a cautious animal. You hear the first carts, the first muffled greetings, the first coins clinking into palms. A woman moves through the market with a basket on her arm. Inside the basket, beneath herbs and folded cloth, there is a letter. It is not romantic in the modern sense. It is practical, careful, almost daring, seeking a gentleman of good character for companionship and mutual respect. Must appreciate an independent lady who owns property and holds opinions. Dowry negotiable. Autonomy not negotiable. It sounds like a joke, and yet documents like this appear in records and letters. Hints that medieval courtship could be strategic, sometimes surprisingly female-driven. Not always, of course. Many marriages were arranged for power, for land, for obligation. But among women who had something rare, freedom and resources, there was room for negotiation. You can feel how revolutionary that is. To sit by candlelight and write calmly what you require. I like to imagine the scene. A rented room above a shop. The air smells of beeswax and wool. A single candle trembles as the wind worries at the window frame. She dips her pen, pauses, listens to her own breathing, then writes as if she is building a door that opens outward. And because she is not desperate, she can be selective. That, more than anything, is the quiet power that runs through these stories. Choice. Some women arranged what they called salons, gatherings that were part business, part conversation, part audition. A table with bread, a pitcher of wine, not too much, just enough to loosen tongues. A few musicians in the corner, a circle of people discussing trade routes and politics and poetry, watching how others behave when a woman speaks with authority. If a man laughs at her ideas, she notes it. If he interrupts, she notes it. If he grows sulky when she is right, she notes it. A small test, almost invisible. But in a world where marriage could erase a woman's legal identity, such tests were not games. They were survival. Some women required trial periods, arrangements where two households remained separate but neighboring. They collaborated on business or property management for a year, seeing if partnership felt like expansion rather than confinement. It is hard to know how widespread such practices were, and the record is uneven. But the very existence of these contracts tells us something. Women were thinking like negotiators, like architects. And then there were the prenuptial agreements, clauses that sound startlingly modern. The right to travel for trade, the right to keep certain income streams separate, the right to approve any sale of property, a promise, on paper, that marriage would not become a trap. I want you to picture the moment a contract is signed. The table is cold under the hands. A clerk reads the clauses aloud, his voice flat, unaware he is witnessing a small rebellion. Wax drips. A seal presses down. The wax holds the shape, a tiny red moon, cooling into certainty. But even with all this strategy, many women chose not to marry at all. Not because they could not, because they could, and still preferred the taste of their own time. And here, we return to a truth that makes the whole story hum. Being alone did not mean being lonely. Court records, household accounts, and personal letters suggest many unmarried women maintained wide circles of friendship, hosted dinners, traveled, studied, laughed. Their solitude could be a luxury, a room where their thoughts could stretch out without apology. You can almost see it. Evening, a small fire. A woman settles into a chair with a book, the leather binding worn smooth by her thumb. Outside, rain taps gently on shutters. Inside, she feels the quiet presence of possibility, not the absence of a husband. Some women wrote about this directly. They used words like grateful, blessed, fortunate. Not every life was happy. Not every woman was safe. And we should never pretend the past was a gentle place. But the stereotype of the miserable, pitiable, unmarried woman does not match the voices that survive. And this is where the story turns again into its darkest subtlety. Because when society could not deny women's contentment, it tried to explain it away. We spoke earlier of medical theories, those strange inventions about wandering wombs and maiden madness. I want to hold that idea softly, not to shock you, but to show how desperate the world can become when faced with evidence it does not want. If a woman is calm, they call it unnatural. If she is prosperous, they call it suspicious. If she says no to marriage, they call it illness. It is a pattern you can feel, even in our own era, like an old draft moving through new buildings. Yet women pushed back. Some scholars argue that certain female physicians and healers, especially those trained within religious communities, offered more grounded observations. They saw with their eyes that many unmarried women were not sick. They were steady. They were focused. They were, in a quiet way, thriving. And because thriving can attract attention, women learned again and again that survival often required community. This is where the sisterhood returns, like a lantern in fog. Networks of mutual aid, sometimes formal, sometimes disguised as simple friendship. Women pooling resources, sharing information about markets and laws, warning each other about dangerous officials, offering a bed for a traveler, a loan for a startup, a witness in court. Imagine the coded letter, a phrase that looks like a recipe, but is really a message. Meet me at the third stall near the river. Bring the blue ribbon. Ask for the extra measure. A tiny language inside the larger language, designed to keep women safe. The effectiveness of such networks is hard to measure, precisely because secrecy was part of the design. But scattered evidence, ledgers, marginal notes, sudden coordinated relocations in records suggests that women did not face the world entirely alone, even when the world insisted they should. And when witch hunts rose, those networks became both target and lifeline. The very fact of female cooperation could be twisted into accusation. Yet even then, some women kept helping, quietly, choosing risk rather than betrayal. I often think about the courage required to remain kind in a climate of fear, to open your door when closing it would be safer, to share bread when hoarding it would be easier, to write a letter of support when silence would protect you. History rarely records that kind of courage cleanly. It appears as a small note, a payment in an account book, a sudden change of address, a woman vanishing from one town and reappearing in another, as if carried by invisible hands. And now, as we bring the story toward its final hearthside hush, we can ask the question that matters most for a sleep story. What is the takeaway that can settle into your body like warmth? It is this: the past did not move in a straight line. Women did not slowly crawl from darkness into light. Sometimes they built something bright, and then the world tried to put out the lamp. Sometimes they held power in markets and convents and letters, and then the world tried to rename that power as shame, sin, or sickness. But the knowledge did not die. It moved underground. It hid in words women chose for themselves. It hid in contracts, in friendships, in whispered advice passed from aunt to niece, in the simple, stubborn fact of a woman saying, quietly, "I belong to myself." If you let that truth rest in you, it becomes less frightening, because it shows that control is never complete, even when society panics, even when it weaponizes language, even when it tries to erase. People find cracks. They plant seeds in those cracks. They pass on what they can. Before you drift fully, let me set one more scene in the lamplight, slow enough that it feels like a lullaby. A ledger lies open on a table in a back room of a cathedral precinct. Not a grand book, just thick paper, stitched together, corners bent, the spine rubbed smooth by many hands. The ink has browned slightly with age, like tea left too long. A woman turns the page with a pat of her finger, careful, respectful, as if the page might bruise. On one line, a small contribution, a few coins. On another, a larger sum, sent to a woman in another city whose shop burned. On another, payment for a messenger, because help must travel somehow. And beside these entries, tiny marks that mean more than money, a sign that a person was heard, a sign that she was not abandoned. Sometimes, I think this is one of the greatest myths we inherit, the myth of the lone hero. These women were brave, yes, but they were also practical. They understood that independence is easier to keep when it is shared, when you know someone will write back, when you know a door will open, when you know that if you are pushed to the edge, there is a hand somewhere ready to steady you. Even during catastrophe, during the years of plague and hunger, the networks adapted. A woman might be too sick to manage her tenants, so another woman travels to handle the accounts. A widow might need protection from a greedy cousin, so friends arrive as witnesses. A young merchant might fear accusations because she owns too much, so she moves her assets quietly into a trust-like arrangement, spreading ownership across allies so no single seizure can destroy her. None of this is easy to prove in perfect detail because survival rarely leaves tidy documentation. But the fragments suggest ingenuity, and that ingenuity has its own quiet beauty. We can widen the lens for a moment and look at the money, because money is not just greed in these stories. It is shelter, it is choice, it is the ability to say no. Some women diversified the way a careful gardener plants more than one crop. A little land for stability, a few urban rentals for regular income. They share in a trading venture for growth, a reserve of coin hidden in a place only she knows, a small private winter store, They did not call it a portfolio, but they understood the idea, and they understood risk. One city's politics could shift. A ruler could become hostile. A law could tighten. So they kept options. They kept networks in other towns. They kept relationships that could help them relocate if they had to. Freedom in a dangerous world is often the art of having more than one exit. It is also the art of leaving a legacy. Many wills show women making bequests to other women, apprentices, nieces, friends, younger merchants, sisters in a community. Sometimes the language is simple. To my friend, a bed and a chest. To my apprentice, tools of the trade. To the poor girls of the parish, a fund for learning. Each gift is a small bridge into the future. And here is something that makes the whole story feel like it has breath. Even after the worst attempts at erasure, echoes remain. In the way women still form networks. In the way the word choice matters. In the way a woman's independence can still provoke commentary that feels oddly old. As if a medieval clerk is still scratching in the margins of the modern world. When you notice those echoes, you do not need to feel angry tonight. Just aware. Awareness can be gentle. It can be like holding a candle near a dark corner and realizing the corner is not a monster, just a corner. The medieval women we have met did not ask for perfection. They asked for space, for the right to work, to learn, to befriend, to lead, to travel, to rest, for the right to belong to themselves. And that is why their story, even wrapped in darkness, can become calming. It reminds you that, even under pressure, people find ways to keep their inner rooms intact. They keep a small hearth inside, and they protect it with whatever tools they can. Let that inner hearth be yours tonight, too. Tonight, as you lie here listening, you do not need to carry the whole weight of this history. Let it be like dust in moonlight, visible for a moment, then settling. Let it be like the river's breath, steady and indifferent to human fear. Let it be like a candle flame that refuses to go out even when the room is full of drafts. Slow your breathing. Feel the heaviness in your limbs, the safe heaviness, like a blanket. Let your jaw loosen. Let your shoulders sink. If thoughts rise, let them drift past like a cart rolling away down a cobbled street, fading into distance. The fire gives one last soft crackle. The candlelight steadies, and somewhere, far back in time, a woman folds a letter, seals it, and smiles to herself, not because the world is kind, but because her life is her own. Good night.